Dear students, especially class 12 students, now I am going to discuss a very important topic with you, that is ratio analysis. Till now, you have prepared the financial statements, you started with journal entries, then ledger posting, then rectification, then outstanding information, adjustments, then came the trial balance, then there was preparation of trading account, profit and loss account, balance sheet. All this work is done by an accountant. His job is to prepare the accounts. Now, once these accounts are prepared, we have to get meaningful information of the business. Now, in order to get a very meaningful information of the business, we have to do analysis of the financial statements. Unless and until you analyze these financial statements, the trading account, the profit and loss account, and the balance sheet, you reach nowhere. Just by having arithmetical accuracy of the data will not lead you anywhere unless you do the analysis. So when we do the analysis of financial statements, we have many techniques: ratio analysis, cash flow analysis, fund flow analysis, comparison of balance sheets, inter-firm comparison, intra-firm comparison. We have these techniques from where we derive a very meaningful information. Now, ratio analysis is one of the techniques by which we derive a lot of meaningful information of the business. How do we do this? Now, we compare two figures. What are those figures? How we come down to those figures? Now suppose, listen to me, if I want to compare the weight of a baby elephant with the weight of a baby human being, will there be any comparison? No. No meaningful comparison. So in order to have a meaningful comparison, I have to find the relevant data from the financial statements. Another example, you have a vast school building and one of your classrooms. Now, if I want to compare the square foot area of your classroom with the entire square foot area of the building, I will not reach to any meaningful conclusions. So what we do in ratio analysis, we get data, relevant data, and we interpret this data. So we divide this into four basic groups. Short-term solvency. By calculating certain ratios, we are able to comment on the short-term solvency of the firm. Then we have long-term solvency. We have to find out whether this company will be able to run on a long-term basis. Third, we would like to see the activity, the efficiency of the firm. And lastly, we calculate the profitability ratios, whether the firm has been able to earn profits or not. So we divide them into four groups basically: the short-term solvency ratios, the long-term solvency ratios, the activity ratios, and profitability ratios. So today, I will comment on short-term solvency ratios of the firm. What is short-term solvency? Short-term solvency is, we have to see whether the firm has enough money to pay its current liabilities. If the firm is not able to pay short-term liabilities, they will always have a problem. It will not be able to survive in the long run. So short-term solvency is very, very important. Now, Here we calculate two ratios. One is current ratio. One is current ratio. And the second one is liquidity ratio. Liquidity ratio. This is also known as acid test ratio. So here we compare two ratios, current ratio and liquidity ratio. Now what is current ratio? In current ratio, we compare current assets, with current liabilities, We compare current assets with current liabilities. Now what are current assets? Current assets are all those assets which are converted into cash within one accounting year. What are current liabilities? Current liabilities are all those liabilities which have to be paid off within one accounting year. So current assets से पैसा आता है, current liability से पैसा जाता है. So we have to be sure that we have enough leverage. So it is said the ideal ratio is 2:1. That means if we have current assets twice the current liabilities, we can say that we will be able to pay off our current liabilities. In current assets, basically you have stock, prepaid expenses, short-term investments, bills receivable, cash in hand, cash at bank. These are all your current assets. What are current liabilities? Bills payable, short-term loans, outstanding expenses. These are your current liabilities. Now, apart from current liabilities, you have to be very clear, any long-term liability which becomes due in the current year will also become current liability. Suppose debentures are due for maturity in the current year, then it will become current liability. So any long-term liability which becomes due, which becomes mature in the current year will also become a current liability. So we have to be very sure that we have enough current assets to pay off the current liabilities. Now, what happens here? In current assets, we have a component called stock. We have another component called prepaid expenses. We have another component called debtors, bills receivable. Now what happens if your stock is not saleable? You are not having stock which is selling. Your current assets will increase. You have prepaid expenses, which you have paid in advance, they will not be converted into cash. So you will not have cash. At times you have given liberal credit. So debtors can be more. You pay them liberal credit. You have extended liberal credit to them. So if this ratio is 2:1, we can say that the company's short-term solvency may be good, but then we have to be very sure whether the short-term solvency is good or not. For that we calculate another ratio called liquidity ratio. So I will come down to that ratio later on. regarding this ratio, I want to tell you something. At times what happens, this ratio can be more than 2 is to 1. So if this ratio is more than 2 is to 1, it could be a reason that we are having more cash in hand, we are having more stock which is not sellable. That is also not good for the business. So, though ideal ratio is 2 is to 1, having more than the ideal ratio, the short-term solvency is not affected, but it is not good for the company's point of view, from the firm's point of view, because that will indicate that you may have more stock which is not saleable, you have more cash in hand which is not required, you may have given, you might have sold goods on liberal terms. So, ideal ratio is 2 is to 1, but if this ratio is less than 2 is to 1, then you might have problems in paying off the current liabilities. So, they can ask you a question like this. They can ask you if the current ratio is 2 is to 1, what happens to the ratio when we pay off debentures? When we pay off debentures. तो जब हम डिबेंचर्स को पे करेंगे तो हमारा यहाँ पे कैश कम हो जाएगा, यहाँ पे हमारा कैश कम हो जाएगा। जब हमारा कैश कम हो जाएगा और यहां पे हमारी लायबिलिटी भी कम हो जाएगी, बट इन अ वे द रेशियो विल इंप्रूव। सपोज हमारा ये है 80,000 और ये हमारा है 40,000, जिसमें हमारे डिबेंचर्स थे 10,000 के, हमने 10,000 के पे कर दिए, ये कितना रह गया 30,000, यहां से हमारा कैश चला गया 10,000, ये कितना रह गया 70,000, ये 2 is to 1 से ज्यादा आ गया, तो रेशियो विल इंप्रूव। तो दे कैन आस्क यू क्वेश्चंस लाइक दैट। नाउ सपोज द करंट रेशियो इज 1 is to 1, करंट रेशियो इज 1 is to 1, ये रेशियो क्या है 1 is to 1 है। सेम थिंग, अब सपोज ये आपके पास 40,000 है और ये भी 40,000 है, आपने यहां से 10,000 रुपए के डिबेंचर्स पे ऑफ कर दिए, यहां से डिबेंचर्स 10,000, कैश 10,000 का चला गया, ये आपका 30,000 रह गया, ये भी आपका 30,000 रह गया। अब रेशियो क्या हो गया 1 is to 1। यहां पे रेशियो इंप्रूव नहीं करेगा, यहां पे रेशियो इंप्रूव करेगा बिकॉज देयर वाज अ लिवरेज ऑफ 2 is to 1। तो हमारा इक्वल अमाउंट का करंट लायबिलिटी कम हुई है और इक्वल अमाउंट का करंट एसेट कम हुआ है, तो हमारा रेशियो इंप्रूव कर जाता है। तो इन एन एग्जामिनेशन दे कैन आस्क यू क्वेश्चंस लाइक दिस, तो यू हैव टू बी वेरी वेरी केयरफुल दैट यू हैव टू सी व्हाट दे आर आस्किंग यू, whether it is current liabilities being paid off, so you just make your working notes and see how to conclude and how to give a conclusion. So they can ask you questions like this also for current ratio. Now, in order to be very sure about the short-term solvency, we calculate liquidity ratio. In liquidity ratio, what we do? We compare quick assets with current liabilities. We compare quick assets with current liabilities. Now, what are quick assets? So, quick assets are all current assets minus stock and minus prepaid expenses. Now, why do we do this? See, it is very difficult to liquidate stock. You sell stock, you will have debentures, you will have bills receivable, then you will have cash. So this item of current assets does not get converted into cash very quickly. And prepaid expenses are those expenses which you have paid in advance. They will not be converted into cash. So these two items are not included in quick assets. Now we compare quick assets with current liabilities. Now if this ratio is 1:1, then you are very safe. That means you can pay off the quick liabilities, you can pay off the liabilities, current liabilities with quick assets. Here you won't have any issue. बट अगर आपका स्टॉक ये 2:1 का रेशियो है और यहाँ पे स्टॉक ज्यादा होता है, प्रीपेड एक्सपेंसेस ज्यादा होते, तब आपका ये रेशियो 1:1 नहीं आएगा. Suppose you have current assets. You have current assets of 1 lakh. ठीक है? And you have current liabilities of 50,000. Ratio is 2:1. रेशियो आपका 2:1 है. नाउ यू हैव स्टॉक ऑफ 25,000. You have stock of 25,000 rupees and you have prepaid expenses of 40,000. So हम 1 लाख में से 65,000 माइनस कर देंगे तो हमारे पास 35,000 रह जाएगा क्विक एसेट्स. और अब हम उसको करंट लायबिलिटी से कंपेयर करेंगे तो हमारा रेशियो 1:1 नहीं आएगा, लेस देन 1:1 आएगा. इसी तरीके से स्टॉक आपका ज्यादा है, प्रीपेड एक्सपेंसेस कम है. कई कंपनीज में क्या होता है, स्टॉक इज मोर. सपोज दिस स्टॉक इज 40,000 रुपीज एंड प्रीपेड एक्सपेंसेस आपके पास 25,000 रुपीज के हैं, तो भी आपका वही वाली सिचुएशन आ जाएगी. सो हम क्विक रेशियो इसलिए निकालते हैं, वी हैव टू बी वेरी श्योर अबाउट द कंपनी शॉर्ट टर्म सॉल्वेंसी पोजीशन. सो बी वेरी केयरफुल व्हेन दे आस्क यू टू कमेंट ऑन द शॉर्ट टर्म सॉल्वेंसी रेशियोज. You have to be very careful. If the current ratio is 2:1 or even more, and the quick ratio is 1:1 or more than 1:1, then the company short-term solvency position is satisfactory. But if the current ratio is 2:1 and the quick ratio is less than 1:1, suppose this is 0.75:1, then you will say that though the current ratio is according to the prescribed norm, but quick ratio is less than the prescribed norm, this will clearly show you that you have stock and prepaid expenses more of stock and prepaid expenses in your current assets. So that clearly indicates that the short-term solvency position is not satisfactory. Now, another case, you have a current ratio of not 2:1. Suppose you have current ratio of 1.5:1 and quick ratio of 1:1. Then also the current solvency, the short-term solvency position of the business is not satisfactory because both the ratios have to be according to the prescribed norm. I repeat again, if the current ratio is more than 2:1 and the quick ratio is more than 1:1, the company's short-term solvency position is satisfactory. Yes, it is not good to have more than 2:1, but regarding short-term solvency position, there is no issues at all. But when you have both the ratios less than the prescribed norm, or even one of the ratios less than the prescribed norm, then you can very confidently say that the company's short-term solvency position is not satisfactory. Now, this is basically what we find out from the analysis. Our analysis means that we have to comment, we have to interpret the data. So in short-term solvency, we have interpreted current assets with current liabilities. And we have also interpreted quick assets with current liabilities. Now don't cram these ratios. Understand what are we doing. Till now you are very clear that what are current assets. Current assets are all those assets which can be converted into cash or any form of cash within one accounting period. And current liabilities are all those liabilities which have to be paid off within one accounting period. So we are comparing current assets with current liabilities. So when we compare current assets with current liabilities, we come to a good conclusion that कंपनी शॉर्ट टर्म सॉल्वेंसी पोजीशन क्या है. अब उसमें हमें डबली श्योर होने के लिए हम एक रेशियो और कंपेयर कर लेते हैं. करंट लायबिलिटीज तो वही रहेगा, बट हम क्विक एसेट्स से कंपेयर करते हैं. अब ये जो क्विक एसेट्स हैं, इसमें हम क्या करते हैं, वी डोंट इंक्लूड स्टॉक एंड प्रीपेड एक्सपेंसेस. इन दो चीजों को हम इंक्लूड नहीं करते. यहां मैंने लिखा है करंट एसेट्स माइनस स्टॉक माइनस प्रीपेड एक्सपेंसेस इज इक्वल टू क्विक एसेट्स. अब क्विक एसेट्स को हम कंपेयर करते हैं करंट लायबिलिटीज के साथ, और ये रेशियो का हमारा 1:1 आ जाता है, तो वी आर वेरी श्योर. तो ये दो रेशियोज फाइंड आउट करने से हमें कंपनी की बहुत कुछ पता चल जाता है. कंपनी की पोजीशन के बारे में, कंपनी की शॉर्ट टर्म सॉल्वेंसी की पोजीशन के बारे में, कंपनी के करंट एसेट्स कितने हैं, करंट एसेट्स के कंपोनेंट्स में कौन से कंपोनेंट्स हैं जो काफ़ी हैवी हैं, काफ़ी ह्यूज अमाउंट्स के हैं. और करंट लायबिलिटीज तो हमें पे ऑफ करनी है, वो हमें पता चल जाता है, ये तो हमारी करंट लायबिलिटीज हैं विच हैव टू बी पेड ऑफ विद इन वन अकाउंटिंग पीरियड. तो शॉर्ट टर्म सॉल्वेंसी रेशियो से, दोनों रेशियो से, बस ये दो रेशियोज कैलकुलेट करे जाते हैं शॉर्ट टर्म सॉल्वेंसी के लिए. बाय कैलकुलेटिंग दीज टू रेशियोज वी आर वेल versed in mind that the company, we are able to comment on the company's short term solvency position. अब इसके बाद आएगा लॉन्ग टर्म सॉल्वेंसी पोजीशंस. मैं उसमें आपके साथ आज उस लेक्चर को नहीं देना चाह रहा हूं, क्योंकि आई वांट यू टू फर्स्ट गो थ्रू दीज टू रेशियोज, डू योर क्वेश्चंस फ्रॉम द टेक्स्ट बुक विच यू हैव, एंड इफ देयर आर एनी प्रॉब्लम्स यू कैन कम बैक टू मी. ठीक है, देन आई विल बी एबल टू कम डाउन टू द लॉन्ग टर्म सॉल्वेंसी रेशियोज. फिर हम लॉन्ग टर्म सॉल्वेंसी रेशियोज में देखेंगे कंपनी की लॉन्ग टर्म सॉल्वेंसी रेशियोज क्या है, कंपनी की लॉन्ग टर्म वायबिलिटी कैसी है, कंपनी क्या लॉन्ग टर्म में सर्वाइव कर पाएगी कि नहीं कर पाएगी. इज दैट क्लियर? ओके, थैंक्स.